Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? It was a bitterly cold evening in early November, and the thick London fog clung to the streets, wrapping the city in an oppressive, murky veil. The dim gas lamps cast flickering shadows across the cobbled lanes, where horse-drawn carriages passed by, their wheels clattering noisily in the quiet of the night. The usual hustle of London seemed muffled, as though the fog had swallowed it whole. In a small but well-appointed office on Baker Street, the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow upon the dark wood of the room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual armchair, the one closest to the fire, his eyes darting across the letters scattered across his desk. His long fingers tapped rhythmically against the surface as he pondered over the case at hand. His ever-loyal companion, Dr. John Watson, sat across from him, looking every bit as perplexed as Holmes himself. "The truth is, Watson," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the silence with its usual precision, "I have been approached by a man who has no name." Watson furrowed his brow, intrigued but uncertain. "A man without a name? Surely that's an exaggeration, Holmes." Holmes looked up from his papers, his sharp eyes meeting Watson's with an almost imperceptible glint of amusement. "Not an exaggeration, my dear Watson. Quite the contrary. The man in question came to me only an hour ago, wearing a grey cloak that obscured his features. He refused to give his name and insisted on keeping his face hidden, even though the room was well lit." "And what did he want?" Watson asked, leaning forward, eager for more details. Holmes steepled his fingers together, his gaze drifting to the window, where the faint outline of the fog could be seen swirling around the street lamps. "He has a peculiar problem, Watson, one that seems simple at first glance, but I assure you it is anything but." As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door, and a low voice called from the hallway, "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." The door opened, and Inspector Lestrade, his heavy boots clacking against the floor, stepped inside. His expression was a mix of frustration and confusion, though his eyes held a certain urgency. "Holmes, I need your help," Lestrade said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handing it over to Holmes. Holmes took the paper with the practised air of one who had seen such documents countless times. He unfolded it and glanced over the contents, his face betraying no emotion. "A murder, Lestrade?" Watson asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Lestrade replied grimly. "But it's not what you'd expect. The victim is a prominent businessman, but his death has left us with more questions than answers. His name was Edward Barrett, and yet—" Holmes raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me guess, Inspector. You found no clue to explain how he died, and his identity seems far too ordinary for such a curious case." Lestrade nodded, his lips tight. "Precisely, Holmes. There's something wrong here. The circumstances surrounding the death make no sense. There were no signs of struggle, no apparent cause of death, and yet the man is quite clearly dead." "Do you have any suspects?" Watson asked. Lestrade hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a hushed tone. "There's a man who was seen near the scene, but he has no name. He was reported by several witnesses, but no one knows who he is or where he came from. The man with no name, They're calling him." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest, and he stood from his chair, moving to grab his coat and hat. "Ah, Watson, I do believe we have a most intriguing puzzle on our hands. A man with no name, a murder with no explanation. This shall be quite the challenge." Lestrade looked at Holmes, bewildered. "You're going to help, then?" "Of course," Holmes replied coolly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "There is nothing that delights me more than unravelling a mystery, especially one as tantalizing as this." As the three of them made their way into the fog-filled streets of London, the sense of unease was palpable. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as though it too was waiting for the resolution of this most unusual crime. Case Introduction. The fog had grown denser by the time they arrived at the scene of the crime. A stately townhouse in one of London's more affluent districts. A solitary gas lamp flickered outside the entrance, casting elongated shadows across the front steps. The door was ajar, and Lestrade pushed it open without ceremony, revealing the disarrayed interior. Holmes stepped inside first, his keen eyes immediately scanning every corner of the room. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco smoke and the faint scent of something metallic. Blood, perhaps? Watson followed, his medical training instinctively alert to any signs of injury. The victim lay sprawled on the floor near an ornate writing desk, his face pale and lifeless. There was no visible wound, no blood, no weapon in sight. A strange stillness hung in the air. Lestrade pointed to a small side table where a peculiar object had been left behind. An antique pocket watch, its glass face shattered, the hands frozen at exactly midnight. Holmes knelt beside the body, studying it with meticulous attention. His fingers brushed over the victim's wrist, checking for a pulse that no longer existed. "Edward Barrett," Holmes muttered. "A man of means, judging by the furnishings. Yet there is something about him that seems too ordinary." Watson, trying to make sense of the scene, spoke. "There's nothing here to suggest a struggle, no signs of forced entry. It's as though the man simply dropped dead." Holmes glanced up, his face impassive. "Indeed, Watson, a most curious death. But if you look closely, you will see that there is more to this than meets the eye." Watson leaned in closer, scanning the room. Holmes was already examining the pocket watch, his long fingers tracing its delicate engravings. It was a fine piece, made of silver, but its true significance eluded Watson. "Do you see it, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice low and deliberate. "See what?" Watson asked, still perplexed. Holmes pointed to a small inscription on the back of the watch. It was barely visible, but with a practised eye, Watson could make out the faint outline of a name. "Barrett," Watson said, his voice rising with confusion. "But that's—" "Exactly, Watson," Holmes interrupted. "The watch belonged to the victim, but look at the time, midnight. The hands are frozen at exactly the same moment, a symbol of finality, wouldn't you agree?" Lestrade, growing impatient, stepped forward. "So, what does all of this mean, Holmes?" Holmes stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he regarded the scene. "It means, Lestrade, that we are dealing with a case far more complex than a simple murder. The man with no name, the pocket watch, the inexplicable death. It is all part of a far larger puzzle, and I intend to solve it. The curious case of Edward Barrett." The heavy fog had begun to seep into the townhouse, curling through the cracks in the door as if trying to claim the scene for itself. Holmes stood in the centre of the room, eyes glinting with a concentration that only he could sustain. His sharp gaze seemed to draw the very essence of the room into his mind, analysing every object and every detail with a precision few could comprehend. Watson, still perplexed, found himself gazing from one corner of the room to the next, unable to see what Holmes saw. He was a man of science, a doctor, and while his observations were not without merit, they were often overshadowed by Holmes's extraordinary deductive prowess. "Holmes, there is no wound," Watson said, his voice tinged with frustration. "No sign of struggle, no blood. How can a man simply die like this?" Holmes did not respond immediately. His fingers had moved from the victim's wrist to the desk, tapping gently along its surface, as though seeking some hidden rhythm in the furniture. He turned his gaze upon Watson, who was still standing near the body, clearly perplexed. "The answer is not in the body, Watson," Holmes said, his voice soft yet firm. "The answer is in the environment. This man didn't die by ordinary means. You must remember that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. We must look beyond what appears to be the obvious." Lestrade, growing visibly impatient, stepped forward. "And what exactly are we supposed to be looking for, Holmes? The man is dead. His watch is frozen at midnight, and there's no sign of foul play. The room tells us nothing." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, and he stepped closer to the writing desk. His fingers brushed lightly across the items scattered upon it. A half-finished letter, a stack of unopened papers, an ink blotter. His gaze lingered on the letter, but it was the edges of the desk that seemed to captivate him the most. He knelt down and examined the floor beneath it, where the light from the gas lamp flickered off the polished wood. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Lestrade," Holmes said, rising to his feet, his voice laced with quiet confidence. "There is much more to this scene than meets the eye." Lestrade frowned, casting a glance at Watson. "More? What more can there be?" Holmes ignored the question, his focus entirely consumed by the room. He turned back toward the body, his expression unreadable. "There is a hidden language in every crime scene, Watson. All one must do is listen." Watson, always willing to follow Holmes's lead, took a few steps closer to the desk, his eyes moving over the scattered papers. The letter on top was addressed to someone named Henry Forsyth. The name meant nothing to him, but it could certainly be relevant. "Henry Forsyth," Watson murmured half to himself. "Who is this?" Holmes was already a few steps ahead, a businessman, a colleague of Mr. Barrett's. They were partners in some ventures, although the details of their relationship are not entirely clear. It seems they had both been involved in a number of investments in the burgeoning railway industry, but I suspect that the good Mr. Forsyth is not entirely innocent. Lestrade, who had been pacing the room, stopped abruptly. "You think Forsyth did this?" Holmes turned sharply, his eyes gleaming. "I didn't say that, Lestrade, but his involvement is certainly worth investigating. You must also remember that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. There is far more to this than a mere business dispute." Watson, following Holmes's lead, glanced over the other papers. Nothing stood out, except for one document tucked beneath a pile of correspondence. It was a small, slightly wrinkled envelope sealed with dark wax. "Holmes, this envelope," Watson began. But Holmes had already crossed the room in 2 swift steps, his long fingers plucking it from the pile before Watson could finish his sentence. Holmes studied the seal for a moment, then broke it with a deft motion. Inside was a single piece of paper, upon which were written a few hastily scrawled words. "Meet me at midnight. The warehouse on Pemberton Street." Watson's brow furrowed. "This is addressed to Barrett?" Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "I believe so, and I believe this is the key to the entire mystery." Lestrade stepped forward, his face suddenly etched with concern. A meeting at midnight? But the watch. It was frozen at exactly midnight. Holmes gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Quite. It is no coincidence that the time of death coincides with the time of the meeting. But we must not assume that the 2 events are directly linked. Instead, we must consider whether Barrett was expected to meet someone, and if so, who would benefit from his absence?" Watson felt a surge of realization. Could someone have planned his death to coincide with this meeting? Perhaps to frame it as a natural cause of death? Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Watson. But the real question is who would want Mr. Barrett dead and why? And what role does this enigmatic letter play in all of it?" Lestrade, clearly growing anxious, glanced around the room. "And the man with no name? Where does he fit into all of this?" Holmes allowed himself a moment of quiet contemplation before answering. "The man with no name is not merely a figure of chance, Lestrade. I believe he is the final piece of the puzzle, though his true nature and purpose remain elusive." For a moment, all 3 of them stood in silence, as if the very air of the room was pregnant with the weight of the mystery. The answer was, out there, somewhere, hidden just beyond their grasp. But Holmes's mind was already a few steps ahead, methodically running through the possibilities in rapid succession. Lestrade, unable to contain his impatience, finally broke the silence. "So, what now? Do we head to Pemberton Street?" Holmes turned to face him, his eyes steady and focused. "Indeed, Lestrade. But before we proceed, there is one final detail to attend to, which is," Holmes smiled thinly, "we must return to Mr. Forsyth. There is something about him, something that doesn't sit right. But first, I need to make a stop. Watson, if you would be so kind." Watson, never one to question Holmes's methods, simply nodded. "Of course, Holmes. Where are we going?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "To the Records Office, Watson. It seems our friend Mr. Forsyth has a history, one that I'm certain will shed light on this tangled affair. The enigmatic history of Henry Forsyth." The London streets seemed to grow quieter as Holmes and Watson made their way through the fog, their footsteps echoing in the dampness of the night. The heavy mist hung like a veil over the city, muffling the usual sounds of horse-drawn carriages and distant voices. It was as though the city itself had drawn a breath, holding itself in suspense, awaiting the outcome of the mystery that had begun to unfold before them. They arrived at the Records Office just before midnight, the stone building looming dark and imposing against the fog-shrouded skyline. Holmes pushed open the heavy wooden door with a soft creak, stepping inside with Watson at his side. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and ink, and the dim light from a single gas lamp illuminated the rows of shelves stacked with ledgers and books. The clerk behind the counter looked up as they entered, his face lighting up with recognition when he saw Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice respectful but tinged with curiosity. "What brings you here at this late hour?" Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. "I require access to the business records for one Henry Forsyth. I believe you may have some information about his financial activities, particularly in relation to the railways." The clerk, though surprised, did not hesitate. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Right away." He shuffled through a set of keys and motioned toward a set of iron doors at the back of the room. "The railway records are kept in the back. Follow me." Holmes and Watson followed the clerk as he led them to a small room filled with heavy volumes of ledgers, each meticulously organized by date and company. The clerk handed Holmes a set of papers that contained the information he had requested, and Holmes immediately began to sift through them with practiced precision. "Mr. Forsyth has been involved in several railway ventures over the years," Holmes remarked, his voice calm but laced with intrigue. "But his investments have been quite erratic, to say the least. He seems to have gained and lost fortunes with remarkable speed." Watson leaned over, glancing at the figures and contracts laid out before them. "But that's hardly unusual in such a volatile industry, is it?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, there is something far more unusual here. Forsyth's dealings are not just erratic. They are, in some cases, downright fraudulent. He has been involved in numerous failed projects, some of which were never even completed. Yet he always seems to find new sources of funding, and his creditors appear strangely unwilling to pursue him." Watson frowned. "But why would anyone continue to fund him if his ventures are failing?" "Ah, that is the question, isn't it?" Holmes replied, his voice thoughtful. "It seems that Forsyth has a talent for deception, Watson, a skill for convincing people that his failed projects are merely setbacks, when in reality they are part of a much darker scheme." The clerk, sensing the direction of the conversation, cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, there is something else you may find of interest." Holmes turned sharply, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "What is it?" The clerk hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There are rumours, sir, that Forsyth has been involved with some rather unsavoury characters in recent months. There have been whispers of secret meetings, dealings with individuals who operate outside the law." Holmes leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What sort of characters?" The clerk glanced nervously around the room before speaking in a lower voice. "I can't say for certain, but I've heard mention of a group who deal in, shall we say, less than legal ventures. It's possible that Mr. Forsyth's business dealings are just a front for something much darker." Holmes gave the clerk a sharp nod. "I see. That is most valuable information, thank you." Watson, still processing the details, spoke up. "But what does this have to do with Barrett's death? If Forsyth is involved in shady dealings, why kill Barrett?" Holmes stood up slowly, his mind clearly already a few steps ahead. "That is the puzzle we must solve, Watson. Perhaps Barrett discovered Forsyth's true nature, or perhaps he was an unwitting pawn in Forsyth's schemes. But one thing is certain. Barrett's death was not an accident, and Forsyth's involvement in it is far from coincidental. As Holmes and Watson left the records office, the night seemed even colder, the fog thicker, as if the city itself was drawing closer, eager to conceal the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. They made their way back to Baker Street, where Holmes wasted no time in beginning his preparations. The information they had gathered was critical, but there were still far more pieces to the puzzle that needed to be uncovered. Early investigation. The following day dawned dull and grey, the fog still hanging low over the streets. Holmes and Watson returned to the scene of Barrett's death, determined to revisit the crime scene with their new knowledge in mind. The house had been sealed off by Scotland Yard, but Holmes had made arrangements to gain entry once more. They entered the study where Barrett's body had been found. Holmes's sharp eyes once again scanned the room with unerring precision. Watson, now more attuned to his companion's methods, did his best to follow along, though much of what Holmes noticed still escaped him. Holmes's first stop was the desk. His fingers lightly traced the edges of the papers, lingering over the letter addressed to Henry Forsyth. He picked up the envelope with care, turning it over in his hands, as if trying to extract some hidden meaning from it. His gaze flicked back to the body, his mind working at a furious pace. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice sharp, "do you notice anything unusual about the way Barrett is positioned?" Watson looked at the body, trying to see it through Holmes's eyes. The man had fallen face up, his limbs sprawled unnaturally around him. "His position is odd," Watson agreed. But what does that mean?" Holmes stepped closer to the body, kneeling down beside it. "There is a subtle clue here, Watson, one that the Yard has missed." Watson watched as Holmes slowly reached out, carefully adjusting the position of the body's left arm. Beneath the sleeve of Barrett's coat, Holmes revealed a small, faint mark, a bruising along the wrist, almost imperceptible. "Do you see it?" Holmes asked, his voice almost a whisper. Watson nodded. "A bruise? But how could that be?" Holmes's expression was one of quiet triumph. "This bruise, Watson, is not the result of a fall. It was inflicted posthumously, and it tells us that Barrett's death was not instantaneous. He was unconscious when he was placed in this position, and that mark is evidence of an attempt to control him." Lestrade, who had arrived at the scene just behind them, frowned at the revelation. So, Barrett was still alive when he was positioned here. But that doesn't make sense. He had no pulse. When we arrived, Holmes looked up, his eyes steady. "A clever trick, Inspector. It seems that the killer wanted to make sure the scene appeared as though Barrett had simply dropped dead, perhaps to avoid suspicion. But this bruising tells a different story. It means Barrett was alive at some point, and he was moved after. He had been incapacitated." Lestrade muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated. So, someone knocked him out, moved him, and then staged the scene to look like an ordinary death. But why? Holmes straightened up, his gaze distant. "That, Inspector, is the question we must answer, and I believe the answer lies in the secret meetings and the man with no name." The fog outside thickened, and Holmes's mind raced forward, threading together the details and contradictions that the case had presented so far. Each clue led to another, and the puzzle was taking shape. The shadows of deception were beginning. to emerge from the mist, but the true motives behind Edward Barrett's death remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. As Holmes and Watson left the scene once more, the city felt colder than ever. The game was afoot, but its resolution seemed just out of reach. Yet, in Holmes's eyes, the answer was already on the horizon, waiting for the final pieces to fall into place. The hidden motive. The morning sun barely managed to break through the dense fog that still clung to the streets of London, as Holmes and Watson made their way to the corner of Pemberton Street. The fog seemed to hold a different character in the early hours, not merely a veil of mist, but a cloak of secrecy, as if the city itself were concealing its darkest truths. Holmes's eyes flicked over the streets, his mind racing through the possibilities of what they might uncover in the next few hours. Their destination was an unremarkable building tucked between two much larger structures, a warehouse of no great distinction. The windows were barred, the entrance low and inconspicuous, but there was something about the place that drew Holmes's attention. It was as though the building itself were trying to blend in, to remain unnoticed, to hide its secrets. As they approached the door, Holmes stopped and placed a hand on Watson's shoulder, signalling for him to wait. "We must be cautious here, Watson," he said quietly, his voice edged with something more serious than usual. "The truth may be nearer than we think, but we must tread lightly." Watson nodded, though he couldn't quite place the underlying tension in Holmes's demeanour. It was rare for his friend to be so cautious, but it only further confirmed how critical the situation had become. Holmes was always deliberate in his approach, but there was a certain urgency today, something lurking just beneath the surface. With a swift motion, Holmes knocked on the door 3 times, the sound echoing in the silence. A moment passed before the door creaked open just enough for a pair of cautious eyes to peer out at them. "I?" The voice came from within, thick with a Cockney accent. Holmes wasted no time. "We're here to inquire about a certain individual, Mr. Henry Forsyth. I believe you know him." The eyes narrowed slightly, as if the figure behind the door was weighing his words. Finally, the door opened further, revealing a stocky man in his mid-40s, dressed in a faded waistcoat and trousers. His hands were rough, his fingers stained with the remnants of oil or some other industrial substance. He glanced briefly at Watson before returning his gaze to Holmes, as if searching for something in his expression. "Mr. Forsyth, eh?" the man muttered. "I know the name, but why would you be asking about him?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his presence commanding the space in a way that made the man instinctively step back. "We believe Mr. Forsyth's business dealings may be linked to the death of a man named Edward Barrett," Holmes continued, his voice even. "I'm sure you understand that matters of life and death are not to be taken lightly." The man's eyes flickered with a mix of suspicion and calculation. He was silent for a moment before finally stepping back, swinging the door open, fully to allow them inside. "You'd best come in, then," he muttered, his voice low. "Can't be having conversations out here, can we?" Holmes stepped into the dimly lit warehouse, followed closely by Watson. The space was vast, the floors cluttered with crates and barrels, the walls lined with shelves filled with tools, equipment, and various odds and ends. The air was thick with the smell of metal and dust, and there was an unmistakable hum of activity, though it wasn't clear if the place was truly busy or simply in a state of disarray. "Mr. Forsyth has been here a number of times," the man said as he led them deeper into the warehouse, his voice growing quieter. "Always at night, always in secret, never for anything too public. He's a man who knows how to keep his dealings private." Watson glanced around, noting the lack of windows and the thick, heavy air. "What kind of dealings?" he asked, unable to suppress his curiosity. The man paused, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. "I don't know the full extent, Governor, but there's been talk of goods. Not the usual sort, mind you. Not anything you'd be wanting to get involved in." Holmes, as always, was keenly aware of the power of silence. He waited for the man to continue, not pressing, but allowing the tension to hang in the air. Eventually, the man spoke again, his voice hushed. "Mr. Forsyth has been meeting with a lot of people you wouldn't expect, if you catch my drift. Folks who ain't afraid to get their hands dirty. There's rumours, you see, of smuggling, and worse. Some of the people I've seen him with, they ain't got no names, just shadows." At the mention of shadows, Holmes's attention sharpened. "Shadows," he repeated. "Interesting. So, you mean these men have no names? None at all?" The man glanced over his shoulder, then back to Holmes, clearly unsettled by the question. "Aye, some of 'em. They come in quiet, don't talk much. Just do what they're paid to do and leave." Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. He exchanged a brief glance with Watson, who could see that his friend's mind was working quickly, connecting the dots with alarming speed. "Shadows," Holmes muttered to himself again. "Men with no names. This fits with what we know of Barrett's final moments. The mystery deepens." He turned back to the man. "Did you see Mr. Forsyth here the night before Edward Barrett's death? Did anything unusual occur?" The warehouse worker's eyes darted nervously, and for a moment Holmes could see that the man was debating whether or not to answer. Finally he spoke. "Mr. Forsyth did come by that night. It was late, near midnight, I reckon. But he wasn't alone. There was another man with him. Tall, thin, with a coat that covered his face mostly. I couldn't make out much else, but they didn't stay long. And after they left, things went quiet." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And after they left, did anyone else come by?" The man shook his head. "No one, sir. Just the usual." Holmes's mind was already racing. The meeting between Forsyth and this shadow figure, the man with no name, was no coincidence. Holmes had no doubt that this mysterious individual held the key to understanding what had truly transpired the night of Barrett's death. "Very well," Holmes said, his tone resolute. "Thank you for your assistance. We may return if we have more questions. But for now, I believe I have enough to proceed." As they left the warehouse and made their way back into the fog-cloaked streets, Watson couldn't shake the sense that they were nearing a discovery that would change everything. The man with no name was the linchpin, and Holmes knew it. "Holmes," Watson asked quietly as they walked, "what do you make of this shadow? Is he truly the key?" Holmes glanced at Watson, a faint knowing smile touching his lips. "The man with no name is more than just a player in this game, Watson. He is the final piece in a complex puzzle. And when we find him, the truth will be laid bare." The fog swirled around them, and Holmes's eyes gleamed with the promise of answers just beyond reach. The game was becoming ever more intricate, but Holmes was always one step ahead, drawing closer to the truth with every step. The man with no name. The rain began to fall just as Holmes and Watson left the darkened alleyway, where the warehouse had stood, its secrets buried deep within its brick walls. The fog had started to lift slightly, but the murkiness of the evening only heightened the sense of mystery that hung thick in the air. As Holmes and Watson navigated through the winding streets of London, their minds were both occupied with the same singular thought: the man with no name. Holmes's eyes, normally sharp and piercing, seemed to carry an even deeper focus. He said little as they walked, lost in thought, while Watson, sensing that the case had now reached its most critical juncture, remained unusually quiet. It was clear that Holmes was piecing together something that Watson couldn't yet fully grasp. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice breaking the silence as they turned a corner onto Baker Street. "It is not simply a matter of tracking down the man with no name. That would be far too simple, even for my tastes. We must understand the context of his existence. We must uncover what ties he has to Forsyth, and how these shadowy figures fit into Barrett's death." Watson, ever the loyal companion, nodded. "But how do we find him? If Forsyth and his associates are so skilled at remaining hidden, it seems an almost impossible task." Holmes turned sharply to Watson, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Nothing is impossible, Watson. It's simply a matter of observing the right connections. Every person, every object, every conversation leaves a trace. It is merely a matter of identifying those traces." The two entered 221B Baker Street, and Holmes immediately made for his desk, which was cluttered with papers, notes, and articles, all detailing the mystery they were now so deeply entangled in. He sifted through them with impressive speed, finding the note they had recovered from Barrett's desk, the one addressed to Forsyth. As Holmes studied it intently, Watson glanced over his shoulder. "You believe this letter is more than it seems, don't you?" Watson asked, though he already knew the answer. Holmes gave a short nod, continuing to scan the letter. "The language here is peculiar, Watson. It is too formal for a man like Forsyth. His usual correspondence, if the clerk's account is to be believed, tends to be far more curt, direct. This letter, however, has a deliberate quality to it. It almost reads like a plea, a request for forgiveness, or perhaps something more, something that could be incriminating." The paper crinkled beneath Holmes's fingers as he placed it carefully aside. He stood up suddenly, his mind clearly working through the next phase of their investigation. "We must pay a visit to Forsyth's residence," he said abruptly. "The letter may be a clue, but the source of that correspondence might yield more. We need to understand who Forsyth trusts and why he communicates in this manner. Wouldn't it be more prudent to follow up on the lead at the warehouse? The man with no name?" Watson asked, a trace of concern in his voice. "We still know so little about him." Holmes turned, his face serious but calm. "Indeed, the man with no name is critical to our case, but we must not overlook Forsyth himself. A man like him, so involved in these illicit dealings, would not risk his own life or reputation without a careful network of allies. Those allies could lead us to the heart of the mystery. Later that afternoon, Holmes and Watson found themselves standing at the door of an imposing townhouse located in the upscale district of Westminster. The residence was far grander than Watson had imagined for a man like Forsyth. Refined, polished, and with an air of quiet opulence that hinted at the vast network of power he had undoubtedly built over the years. As they approached, Watson could feel the weight of Holmes's resolve, a sense that they were about to unearth something far more dangerous than they had previously anticipated. Holmes knocked sharply on the door, and after a brief delay, it opened to reveal a butler, his expression one of polite indifference. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, may I assist you?" Holmes did not waste time on pleasantries. "We would like to speak with Mr. Forsyth regarding a matter of great importance. It is of a personal nature, and I am sure he would not mind seeing us briefly." The butler hesitated, his eyes flicking between the two men. "I'm afraid Mr. Forsyth is not available at present, sirs. Perhaps you would care to leave a message." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "You misunderstand, my good man. It is not a matter of leaving a message. It is a matter that requires his immediate attention. I am sure he will wish to speak with us." After a moment's pause, the butler stepped aside, allowing them entry into the grand hallway. The air within was warm, but the silence that enveloped the house felt stifling, as though it were holding its breath in anticipation. The butler led them to a sitting room, where Holmes and Watson took their seats, awaiting Forsyth's arrival. Holmes, ever the observant one, began to study the room. Its furnishings, the arrangement of objects, the painting on the wall. He took it all in, his mind already drawing conclusions. But Watson, ever the more patient of the two, sat back and waited. Minutes passed, and the tension in the air seemed to build. Finally, the door opened, and in stepped Henry Forsyth, his tall frame filling the doorway. His face was as sharp and angular as his reputation, with piercing eyes that seemed to assess the situation immediately upon seeing the two men. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Forsyth said with a slight nod, his voice smooth and controlled. "I must admit I am somewhat surprised by your visit. What is it that brings you to my humble home?" Holmes stood and fixed him with a direct gaze. "We have come to discuss a matter of some urgency, Mr. Forsyth. It concerns your involvement with Mr. Edward Barrett and the recent unfortunate events surrounding his death." Forsyth's expression remained inscrutable, but his eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication of any shift in his demeanour. "Barrett!" he repeated, his tone colder now. "I hardly see what my business with Barrett has to do with you." "It has everything to do with us, Mr. Forsyth," Holmes replied coolly, his tone firm, yet not without a certain politeness. "We have reason to believe that Barrett's death is linked to some of your more unsavoury dealings. And if you wish to avoid further scrutiny, I would suggest you assist us in uncovering the truth." Forsyth's eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement or annoyance. It was hard to tell. He took a step forward, lowering his voice slightly. "You are quite bold, Mr. Holmes, perhaps too bold for your own good. I assure you, I have nothing to do with Barrett's death. Any such claims are entirely without foundation." Holmes did not falter. "The foundation, Mr. Forsyth, is built on facts, not claims. And those facts point directly to you and your involvement in affairs far more dangerous than you may be willing to admit. A brief silence hung between them, charged with a quiet tension. Forsyth's eyes flickered momentarily. Then he gave a tight smile. "I trust you will not be so hasty in your conclusions, Mr. Holmes. The truth, I assure you, is never as simple as it seems." Holmes's eyes never left Forsyth's face, his expression unreadable. "We shall see, Mr. Forsyth, we shall see." As Holmes and Watson departed Forsyth's residence, the weight of the conversation lingered. There was no doubt in Holmes's mind that Forsyth knew far more than he was letting on. The carefully cultivated veneer of propriety masked something far darker, something that might be the key to understanding Barrett's death and the role of the man with no name. The stakes were rising, and the game was now at a critical turning point. As they stepped back into the cold night, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that the web they were unravelling had become far more intricate, and the shadows of the city were growing longer. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, "what do you believe? Forsyth is hiding?" Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "The truth, Watson, is rarely found on the surface, and I believe Mr. Forsyth's carefully constructed world is about to come crumbling down." As the rain continued to fall, Holmes's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of the next step in the investigation, a step that would soon reveal the hidden depths of deception at play. The Hidden Hand. The early morning fog was thick as Holmes and Watson returned to 221B Baker Street after their tense meeting with Henry Forsyth. The streets, often bustling with the usual chaos of London, now appeared oddly still, as if holding their breath in anticipation of what was yet to come. Watson, ever observant of Holmes's demeanour, noticed his companion's contemplative silence. Holmes was known for his unwavering confidence, but there was something in his posture, a slight tightening of his jaw, that hinted at an unsolved puzzle gnawing at his mind. "Holmes," Watson began, breaking the silence. Forsyth's response was intriguing, to say the least. "Do you truly believe he's involved in Barrett's death?" Holmes's eyes remained fixed ahead, scanning the fog-drenched streets, his pace measured but deliberate. Involved? Perhaps. But Watson, involvement does not necessarily equate to guilt. It is a delicate web we tread, and I suspect Forsyth is but one thread in a much larger tapestry of deception. Watson was quiet for a moment, absorbing his friend's words. "And the man with no name?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "How does he fit into all of this?" Holmes paused at the door to 221B, his hand resting on the brass handle. "That, my dear Watson, is the key. The man with no name is the central figure in this enigma. His presence looms over everything, yet we know so little about him. I believe that understanding who he is will unlock the final piece of this puzzle." They entered their quarters, the warmth of the fireplace offering some respite from the chill of the morning. Holmes moved with purposeful strides to his desk, where piles of papers and notes lay scattered. His fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the desk as his sharp eyes scanned over the letters, the newspaper clippings, and the maps that had become the foundation of their investigation. Watson watched him intently, sensing that Holmes was on the verge of a breakthrough. "I need more information, Watson," Holmes said abruptly, his voice low but filled with intensity. "We must revisit the warehouse. There is something I missed, something crucial that will reveal the identity of this mysterious man and his connection to Forsyth." Watson frowned. "But surely, Holmes, we've already combed the warehouse for every clue. What more could there be?" Holmes turned to face him, his gaze piercing as always. "When you observe something for the first time, Watson, you see what is most obvious. But when you look again, with a different perspective, you begin to notice what was hidden in plain sight. The warehouse holds more than just remnants of the crime. It holds the answers we seek. But we must look deeper." The two men found themselves standing once again at the edge of the old warehouse, in the dim light of late morning. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and the distant sounds of the city, muffled by the thick fog that clung to the ground. Holmes stood before the entrance, his eyes scanning the surrounding area, as if the very bricks of the building were whispering their secrets. "Here," Holmes said suddenly, pointing to a spot just beyond the threshold of the warehouse door. Watson leaned in closer, but there was nothing particularly remarkable about the location. It was an ordinary stretch of ground, littered with discarded crates and scattered debris. "You see nothing, do you, Watson?" Holmes continued, his voice tinged with amusement. "Most would overlook this, but look closely, and you will notice the faint marks in the dirt. They are not random. They were made deliberately." Watson's brow furrowed. "Marks? I don't see anything." Holmes crouched down, and with a deft hand began to clear away the debris, revealing a faint pattern of footprints in the dust, shallow, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. They seemed to lead toward the rear of the warehouse, where a narrow passageway disappeared into darkness. Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. These marks were made by a man who knew exactly where he was going, Holmes muttered to himself, and these footprints, though faint, are not the type of prints made by the average individual. These are deliberate, almost measured. Watson took a step back, watching as Holmes's mind began to churn, his thoughts racing ahead. "So, you believe someone entered through this very spot?" "Precisely," Holmes said, straightening. "The man with no name, or one of his associates, must have used this passageway. This was no ordinary break-in, Watson. The entry was calculated, intentional. But who could have such knowledge of this place?" Holmes turned toward the narrow passageway, his gaze fixed with a sense of growing determination. "We must follow these marks, Watson. They will lead us to the heart of this mystery. The man with no name will reveal himself soon enough." The passageway was dark, its walls crumbling with age, and the musty smell of damp stone filled the air. As they ventured deeper into the darkness, the only sounds were the soft echo of their footsteps and the faint rhythmic creaking of the old wood. Holmes, as always, led the way, his mind focused on the task at hand. At the end of the passage, they reached a small hidden room. The space was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows against the walls. On the floor, scattered around the room, were remnants of what appeared to be recent activity. Discarded papers, a set of ink-stained gloves, and a set of strange markings etched into the floor. Holmes knelt down to examine the markings. His eyes narrowed in concentration, and he traced the lines with his fingers. "This is no coincidence," he murmured. "These are symbols. A coded message, perhaps." Watson leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the markings. "What do they mean?" Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "I believe this is where the trail finally grows clear. These symbols are not random. They are part of a larger system, a network, a language. Whoever made these marks wanted someone to find them, and they wanted us to follow." "Follow?" Watson echoed. "But to what end? What do they want us to uncover?" Holmes rose to his feet, his eyes glittering with the promise of revelation. "The answer, Watson, is closer than we think. The man with no name is not merely hiding. He's waiting for us to uncover the truth, and when we do, we will understand why he remains so elusive." As Holmes and Watson left the hidden room, their minds were racing with possibilities. The puzzle was slowly coming into focus, but it was far from complete. The man with no name, Forsyth's cryptic behaviour, the symbols in the warehouse, all of these pieces were intricately woven together, each one offering a clue that brought them closer to the heart of the mystery. "Holmes," Watson said as they stepped back into the light of day, "how much longer do you think it will take to uncover the full truth?" Holmes, his expression as inscrutable as ever, glanced up at the grey sky. "Not long, Watson. Not long at all." The final confrontation was coming, and Holmes could feel it. The man with no name was playing a dangerous game, and Holmes was more than ready to expose the truth, no matter where it led. A game of shadows. The day wore on with an unsettling stillness. Holmes and Watson had spent the afternoon analysing the strange symbols in the hidden room. But even with Holmes's unparalleled insight, the mystery remained elusive. The symbols, though intricate, had no immediate meaning that could be deciphered. Each attempt at interpretation seemed to lead to more questions than answers. Holmes, uncharacteristically silent, had retreated to his armchair by the fire in 221B Baker Street, his mind clearly racing. Watson, ever the loyal companion, had settled across from him, his thoughts wandering back to the enigmatic man with no name. "Holmes," Watson began cautiously, "do you believe we are closer to finding the identity of our mysterious figure?" Holmes, his eyes unfocused as he stared into the flames, took a long pause before responding. "Closer, Watson, yes. But we are not there yet. The key lies not in what we have found, but in what we have not. There is someone out there who holds the answer, and they are watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move." Watson frowned, unable to suppress a sense of growing unease. "But who, Holmes? Who is it that would go to such lengths to keep themselves hidden?" Holmes turned his sharp gaze toward Watson, his voice steady, almost cold. "Someone with everything to lose. Someone who has orchestrated this entire charade, this game, knowing that only a mind as precise as mine could follow the thread to its conclusion." Before Watson could reply, the door to 221B creaked open, and Mrs. Hudson, their ever-reliable landlady, entered with a letter in hand. Her face was pale, and her eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said breathlessly, "a letter has arrived for you. It was hand-delivered, no return address. But there's something odd about it." Holmes took the letter from her, his fingers brushing the thick, cream-coloured paper. The envelope was blank save for a single symbol drawn in ink, a symbol that sent a chill down Watson's spine. It was the same symbol that had been etched into the floor of the hidden room in the warehouse. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he carefully opened the letter, his gaze flicking over the carefully scripted message. "You are getting closer, Holmes, but you are still far from the truth. There are deeper shadows to be uncovered. You will find the next clue where the past and present collide. Be careful, for the game is not yet won. The Man with No Name." "Remarkable," Holmes muttered, his voice tinged with amusement. "The game continues." Watson, his curiosity piqued, leaned forward. The past and present collide? What could that mean? Holmes stood, his mind already shifting gears as he began pacing the room. "It is a reference, Watson. A metaphor, perhaps. The man is not merely hiding from us. He is guiding us. He wants us to follow these clues, to find the trail that will lead to his identity. But he is testing us, challenging us to see what others would overlook." "So, where do we go next?" Watson asked. Holmes paused, his hand resting on his chin as he stared at the symbol on the envelope. The deeper meaning was starting to take shape in his mind. The clue suggests a collision of time, past and present. I believe we must visit a place that holds significance, not just in the present, but in history. A place where events once unfolded and left their mark upon this city. Watson's eyes widened with realization. "Could you mean—" Holmes nodded, his face a mask of determination. "Yes, Watson, we must visit the old museum on King's Road. It was there, years ago, that a notorious robbery took place, the one that remains unsolved. The robbery where no one ever knew the thief's true identity. The King's Road Museum stood as a silent witness to the passage of time, its grand stone columns and weathered facade carrying the weight of history. Even in the late afternoon light, the museum felt oddly forsaken, its presence looming over the street as if it were a monument to forgotten events. Holmes and Watson approached the grand entrance, their footsteps echoing in the empty courtyard. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The museum was eerily quiet, the shadows cast by the tall glass windows stretching long across the marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of aged books and dust, the kind that only an old institution could hold. "I don't understand, Holmes," Watson murmured as they moved through the dimly lit galleries. "Why would the man with no name want us here? What connection does this place have to him?" Holmes, whose eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings, seemed lost in thought. "It's not the museum itself, Watson, but what it represents. The robbery that took place here years ago was no ordinary crime. It was a heist of rare and valuable artifacts, pieces of history that vanished without a trace. No one knew who was behind it, but I have always suspected that the thief was someone of particular intellect, someone who could outwit even the best minds in Scotland Yard." Ensure. Watson was taken aback. "So you think the man with no name is connected to this robbery?" "I do," Holmes replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "It is not a coincidence that he would lead us here. The past and present collide, as the letter suggested. There is a reason why this place holds such significance. I believe that within these walls lies the answer to our mystery." Holmes walked deliberately toward a display case that stood in the center of the room. The case contained an ancient golden idol, its surface engraved with strange markings. The same markings that had appeared in the hidden room in the warehouse. Holmes knelt down before it, examining the idol with a critical eye. "This," Holmes said softly, "this is the key." Watson crouched beside him, studying the idol with growing intrigue. "You believe this idol is tied to the man with no name?" Holmes didn't immediately answer. Instead, he traced his fingers lightly over the carvings on the idol, his expression unreadable. "I believe the idol is not just a relic of the past, Watson. It is a symbol that someone has used to conceal their identity, to hide in plain sight. Whoever orchestrated the robbery, and who continues to play this dangerous game, is someone who understands how to manipulate both history and perception." Watson's heart skipped a beat. So, this idol, could it be the link between the man with no name and Forsyth? Holmes stood abruptly, his eyes fixed on the idol, a sudden realization dawning in his mind. Yes, Watson, this idol is far more than just a piece of stolen treasure. It is the final piece of the puzzle, the missing link that connects everything. As Holmes and Watson stood in front of the display, the air around them seemed to grow, heavier, thick with the weight of the past and the tension of the present. The man with no name was no longer a shadow in the background. He was now a central figure in this tangled web of history, deception, and crime. And as Holmes turned to face Watson, his eyes gleamed with the promise of the truth yet to be revealed. "We are close now, Watson," Holmes said, his voice firm, "closer than ever before." But even as he spoke, a strange sense of foreboding settled over them. The final act of this dangerous game was approaching, and the stakes had never been higher. The unseen hand. As Holmes and Watson left the museum, the late evening fog had thickened, casting an almost tangible pall over the streets of London. The city, which had once seemed alive with the clamour of carts and the chatter of pedestrians, now appeared as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion of this intricate game. Watson, his thoughts still consumed by the events at the museum, walked in silence beside Holmes. They had found something significant in the golden idol, something that tied the theft, the strange markings, and the enigmatic man with no name into a single, dangerous narrative. Yet even as the pieces began to fall into place, there was an unsettling feeling in the air. The more they uncovered, the more elusive their quarry became. Holmes's face was unreadable, his mind clearly working at full capacity. He had not spoken a word since leaving the museum, but Watson could tell that his mind was racing with new possibilities, new connections. "Holmes," Watson ventured, breaking the silence, "what exactly do you think the idol represents? Why would the man with no name be so intent on keeping us in the dark about it?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed ahead, his eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and frustration. "It's not the idol itself, Watson, but what it signifies. It is a symbol, a key to understanding the larger game at play. The markings on the idol, the robbery at the museum, all of it is connected to something far more intricate, far more dangerous than we could have initially imagined. The man with no name has carefully constructed a web of lies, all designed to lead us to one inevitable conclusion." Watson looked at his friend, his brow furrowing. "But what is that conclusion, Holmes? What does he want from us?" Holmes stopped abruptly in the middle of the street, his eyes flashing with a new intensity. "I believe, Watson, that we have been playing into his hands all along. The man with no name is not merely hiding from us. He has been orchestrating our every move. He has been leading us down this path, forcing us to unravel his puzzle step by step, knowing full well that we will reach the truth. But that truth will not be what we expect." Watson felt a chill run down his spine. "So, you think the answer we're seeking isn't the one we think it is?" Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze sharp as ever. "Precisely. The man with no name is a master of misdirection. He has constructed this elaborate game not to escape capture, but to manipulate our understanding of the very facts we believe to be true." A sudden sense of foreboding gripped Watson. "But if he's playing with us like this, what does that mean for us, Holmes? Are we merely pawns in his game?" Holmes's eyes darkened, his voice lowering. "We are not pawns, Watson, but we are being tested. The man with no name wants us to reach the wrong conclusion, to believe we understand his motives. When we arrive at that wrong answer, he will be waiting to strike." The two men arrived back at 221B Baker Street well after dusk, their minds heavy with the burden of the day's discoveries. Mrs. Hudson, seeing the exhausted look on their faces, offered them a warm cup of tea, though neither Holmes nor Watson seemed interested in the comforts of home at that moment. Holmes wasted no time, immediately pacing the room as he began to connect the various strands of the case. The idol, the markings, the robbery, and the letter. All these elements had been set in motion by a single, unseen hand. But whose hand was it, and what did they want? "Watson, I believe we are on the verge of something," Holmes said, his voice suddenly sharp with purpose. "The idol is not merely a stolen artifact. It is the means by which our adversary has been hiding in plain sight. The markings on it, those strange symbols, are part of a larger code, one that, when fully decoded, will lead us to the identity of the man with no name." Watson leaned forward, his mind racing with this new revelation. "You think the code will reveal who he truly is?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, and I believe it is directly tied to Forsyth. The man with no name is closer than we think. I suspect that the robbery at the museum, along with the theft of the idol, is part of a much more personal vendetta, one that stretches back years. Forsyth's involvement is no coincidence." The realization hit Watson like a bolt of lightning. "You think Forsyth has been manipulating this entire affair? That he is somehow behind the scenes?" "Precisely," Holmes said, "but not in the way you might think. Forsyth is a puppet, and the man with no name is the puppet master. The robbery, the symbols, the deaths, all of it is a carefully crafted scheme designed to conceal one thing: Forsyth's connection to the larger conspiracy." "Are you suggesting that Forsyth isn't the victim, but rather an unwitting accomplice?" Watson asked. Holmes's gaze was intense as he replied, "I don't believe Forsyth is entirely innocent, but he is being controlled. The man with no name is playing him as he plays us. The question is, why?" The clock ticked on into the night, and Holmes sat before a map of London, tracing the movements of the key players with his finger. He began to speak aloud, as if the act of verbalizing his thoughts would help him solve the puzzle. "Let us consider the facts, Watson. The robbery was orchestrated with precision. The idol was stolen and replaced with a counterfeit. The markings on the idol were left deliberately to create a trail. The man with no name has been manipulating Forsyth's every move, just as he has been manipulating us. But his ultimate goal remains unclear. Watson, deep in thought, added, and Forsyth himself. He must have known something about the idol's significance. Perhaps he, too, was involved in the original robbery. Holmes looked at him, his expression sharp. I have no doubt that Forsyth knows more than he has let on. But he is afraid of the man with no name, and afraid of what the truth will reveal. We must confront him, Watson. We must force him to speak. As Holmes stood, his eyes narrowing, with renewed determination, Watson followed his gaze. They were no longer chasing shadows. They were on the precipice of a revelation, and the game was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. The man with no name had played his cards well, but Holmes was closing in. The final move was theirs to make. Prepare yourself, Watson. Holmes said, his voice a low murmur. We are about to face the truth, and nothing will be the same afterward. The web unravels. The air in 221B Baker Street felt thicker as Holmes and Watson made their preparations to confront Forsyth. Holmes, ever meticulous, moved about the room with a singular purpose. His hands were steady, but his mind, Watson knew, was whirring at an almost unnatural speed. Watson, for his part, couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him during their conversation. They were stepping into the final act of a dangerous game, one where the stakes had grown higher with each passing hour. Watson, Holmes said, breaking the silence as he finished adjusting the folds of his coat. We must be precise in our approach. Forsyth will be expecting us to confront him, but he will not be prepared for the methodical nature of our inquiry. Watson, although far from being a master of deduction like his friend, could sense the weight of their next steps. And what exactly do you intend to ask him, Holmes? He is clearly hiding something, but what can we do to make him reveal it? Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing, as if considering the question carefully. We must present him with the truth, Watson, but not all at once. We will allow him to think he is in control, but in reality, we will be guiding him toward the inevitable conclusion. He must believe that his secret is safe, even as we expose the cracks in his facade. They left the safety of Baker Street just as dusk settled over the city. The fog had begun to roll in thick, clinging to the streets in a way that seemed to further obscure the path ahead. The familiar sounds of London felt muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Holmes led the way with his usual unshakable confidence, his steps purposeful and measured. Watson followed closely, his mind swirling with thoughts of Forsyth and the strange puzzle they had been piecing together. How much did Forsyth truly know? And if he was not the mastermind behind the elaborate scheme, how far would he go to protect the one who was? The walk was long, but neither man spoke much, both lost in their thoughts. They arrived at Forsyth's residence just as the evening began to fall fully into place. The large, imposing townhouse stood in stark contrast to the surrounding buildings, its dark windows giving it an almost foreboding appearance. Holmes stood for a moment, surveying the structure with a sharp gaze. "Remember, Watson," Holmes murmured, "our aim is not to confront Forsyth with accusation, but with revelation. We will guide him to admit what he has been trying to hide all along. The door to Forsyth's townhouse creaked open at their knock, revealing a tall, thin butler who regarded them with a suspicious glance. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" the man inquired, his voice cold and formal. "Yes, we've come to speak with Mr. Forsyth," Holmes said smoothly, offering his signature disarming smile. The butler hesitated for a brief moment before stepping aside, ushering them in. "Very well, gentlemen. Mr. Forsyth is expecting you." They were led down a long corridor, past rooms adorned with fine artwork and elegant furnishings, all the trappings of wealth and refinement. Yet even as they moved through the house, Watson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Something about the atmosphere was off, too perfect, too staged. They reached the drawing room, where Forsyth was waiting, standing by the fireplace with an air of casual arrogance. The man, though clearly distressed, appeared composed. His immaculate suit and carefully styled hair suggested a man who took pride in his appearance and his position. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Forsyth said, greeting them with a slight nod. "I wasn't expecting such an impromptu visit. Please sit." Holmes moved toward the seat closest to the fire and lowered himself into it with a deliberate, almost theatrical grace. Watson followed suit, but he kept his gaze fixed on Forsyth, waiting for the right moment. "We won't take up too much of your time, Mr. Forsyth," Holmes began, his tone measured and smooth. "We've come to discuss a matter that concerns you directly." Forsyth's expression shifted minutely, but he maintained his composure. "I am afraid I don't follow, Mr. Holmes. What could concern me so greatly that it requires your presence?" Holmes's eyes sparkled with a mix of curiosity and resolve. "It concerns a matter of great importance, Mr. Forsyth. One that has recently resurfaced after many years. It pertains to an incident at the King's Road Museum." The mention of the robbery seemed to strike a chord with Forsyth, his eyes flicking to the side for the briefest of moments. It was a subtle shift, but Holmes noticed it immediately. "Ah, the robbery," Forsyth said with a forced chuckle, his voice now tinged with nerves. "I had heard you were investigating that old affair, but I fail to see how it involves me." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Indeed, Mr. Forsyth, it involves you far more than you might like to admit. You see, we've learned much in our investigation, more than I suspect you would care for us to know." Forsyth's composure faltered just slightly, and Holmes seized upon the opportunity. "We know, Mr. Forsyth, that the robbery was not a random event. We know that it was orchestrated by someone who had intimate knowledge of the museum's operations, someone who understood how to exploit the weaknesses of the security system." Watson watched intently as Forsyth's gaze shifted again, a look of uncertainty flashing briefly in his eyes, before he quickly regained control. Holmes continued, undeterred. "We also know that the idol stolen from the museum, a priceless artifact, was not merely a relic of historical importance. No, it was something more. It was a symbol, a key to something much larger. And we know that you, Mr. Forsyth, are far more connected to that theft than you would like us to believe." Forsyth took a sharp breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his chair. "You're wrong, Holmes. I have nothing to do with it. Nothing at all." Holmes remained calm, his expression one of quiet certainty. "I disagree, Mr. Forsyth. You were involved, but not in the way you think. The man who orchestrated the theft, the man who has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, has been manipulating you, and you've been too blind to see it." The room seemed to grow colder as Forsyth's face paled, his mouth twitching, with the effort of keeping his composure. "You don't know what you're talking about. I am not a part of this. I've never been involved in anything illegal." Holmes stood abruptly, his tall figure looming over Forsyth. "The truth, Mr. Forsyth, will come out, whether you wish it or not. You are not the mastermind behind the theft, but you are certainly complicit. The man with no name is the one we seek, and he is the one who has controlled you, just as he has controlled us." Forsyth's eyes darted to the door, his body visibly tense. It was clear that he was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. You're wrong," he said weakly, his voice a mere whisper now. I didn't know. I didn't know." Holmes fixed him with a final piercing look. "We'll see, Mr. Forsyth, we'll see." The final revelation. The tension in Forsyth's drawing room grew almost unbearable, the only sound being the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Holmes stood, his posture straight and commanding, his gaze never wavering from the man who was, now beginning to show the strain of being caught in the web he had woven so carefully. Forsyth, though clearly rattled, tried to maintain his composure, his lips pressing into a tight line as he clenched his fists at his sides. "You believe I am somehow involved," Forsyth said, his voice low and shaky. "But you're wrong. I have nothing to do with this conspiracy you speak of." Holmes's sharp eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the man, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. "Do not mistake me, Mr. Forsyth," Holmes replied, his tone cool and calculated. "I am not suggesting that you are the mastermind. I know that you are not the architect of this crime, but you are certainly a player in it. You are the link to someone far more dangerous, someone whose identity remains elusive, but not for long." Watson, standing quietly at Holmes's side, could feel the weight of the moment. Holmes had known from the start that Forsyth was not the true villain, but rather a pawn caught in the machinations of a far more cunning and dangerous individual. It was the man with no name, the one who had orchestrated the robbery, the one who had set everything in motion. And Holmes, with his unparalleled ability to read the smallest of details, was now closing in on the final piece of the puzzle. "Who is he?" Forsyth whispered, his voice cracking under the strain of Holmes's unyielding gaze. "Who is the one pulling the strings?" Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "That, Mr. Forsyth, is a question that only you can answer. The truth is simpler than you realize. All the clues point to one person, and that person is closer than you think. He is someone you trust, someone who has been hiding in plain sight, and someone who has been manipulating you for far longer than you could possibly have imagined." Forsyth's eyes flickered nervously. "I don't understand. Who are you talking about?" Holmes leaned forward, his face inches from Forsyth's, the sharp scent of cologne mixing with the smoke from the fire. "I am talking about your business partner, The man you've known for years. The man you have never suspected of being anything but a colleague. The man who has been using you all along. The realization hit Forsyth like a bolt from the blue, his face draining of colour as the truth settled over him. No, it can't be. Not Edmund. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of solving the riddle. Yes, Edmund, your trusted associate, the one who has shared your business dealings and financial success. Edmund, the man who stands to gain everything from the theft of the artifact. He is the mastermind behind this entire scheme, the one who has been manipulating you and everyone else in order to secure his own wealth and power. Watson could see the panic building in Forsyth's eyes. The man was beginning to crumble under the weight of his own realization. Edmund, the man Forsyth had trusted above all others, had been playing him from the very beginning. But why? Why would he do such a thing? Forsyth stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Holmes stood upright again, his expression one of quiet triumph. Greed, Mr. Forsyth. Greed and a desire for power. Edmund knew that the artifact from the King's Road Museum held not just historical value, but also the key to a hidden fortune, a fortune that could make him richer than he had ever dreamed. And he knew that you, Mr. Forsyth, were the perfect means to an end. You were the one person who could facilitate the theft, the one person who could provide him with the access he needed. But you were never meant to be part of the final plan. Holmes's words rang with finality, and Forsyth seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging in defeat. But how did you know? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Watson, giving him a look that was both contemplative and satisfied. The clues were always there, Watson. Small things, easy to overlook, but essential too. The puzzle. Edmund's sudden wealth, his odd behaviour during the days leading up to the robbery, his knowledge of the museum's operations. These were all signs pointing to one thing. Edmund had inside knowledge of the heist, and he was clever, enough to use Forsyth as a pawn, all the while hiding his true motives. Holmes's gaze returned to Forsyth, who was now trembling with the full weight of the betrayal he had experienced. You were merely a tool, Mr. Forsyth, a stepping stone in Edmund's carefully laid plan, and you never once suspected him. That is, until now. Forsyth's eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. I never knew. I never suspected. Holmes gave a small, almost pitying smile. That is the nature of these things, Mr. Forsyth. The people closest to us are often the ones who deceive us the most. Edmund knew your weaknesses, your ambitions, and he used them against you. It was at that moment, as Holmes was about to turn and give the signal for the authorities to enter the room, that the final twist occurred. The door to the drawing room swung open with a sudden crash, and in stepped none other than Edmund himself. His face, usually so composed, was twisted with a mixture of rage and defiance. His eyes locked onto Forsyth, who stood there, frozen in place, shock written all over his face. You! Edmund hissed, his voice low but filled with venom. You should never have come here, Forsyth. You were never supposed to find out. Holmes remained unfazed, his stance unshaken as he stepped forward. It seems, Edmund, that you underestimated the power of observation. You have been very careful, very clever, but even the smallest mistake can unravel a plan. Edmund's eyes flickered to the doorway, where several constables were now standing, their presence a silent but effective reminder of the gravity of the situation. The man's face fell, and for a brief moment his facade cracked, revealing the panic beneath. "You won't get away with this, Holmes," Edmund sneered. But there was an unmistakable tremor in his voice. "You think you've won? This is far from over." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his voice a calm but resolute whisper. "The game is over, Edmund. You've lost." As the constables moved to arrest Edmund, Watson stood in quiet awe, watching as the pieces of the case finally fell into place. Holmes once again had exposed the truth behind the mystery, guiding them through the maze of deception with a skill that never ceased to amaze him. Forsyth, though shaken, was clearly relieved to be free of Edmund's manipulation. But it was clear that he would carry the weight of his own part in the deception for the rest of his life. As Holmes and Watson left Forsyth's residence, the cold night air hit them with its familiar bite. The case, at long last, was solved. Holmes glanced at Watson, his expression inscrutable. Another mystery unravelled, Watson. Another case closed. But there will always be more, won't there? Watson nodded, his admiration for Holmes as deep as ever. "Indeed, Holmes, there will always be more." And with that, the two men disappeared into the fog of London, leaving behind another puzzle solved and another dark corner of the city illuminated by the light of Holmes's genius. The aftermath and reflection. The next morning, as Holmes and Watson sat in the quietude of their Baker Street apartment, a palpable sense of completion hung in the air. The investigation that had consumed their recent days had now come to an end, the threads of deception unravelled, and the true mastermind, Edmund, arrested. Yet, as Watson observed Holmes, his friend appeared anything but triumphant. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, his fingers absent-mindedly drumming on the arm of his chair as he gazed out of the window at the fog-choked streets of London. "Holmes," Watson ventured cautiously, breaking the silence, "I must admit I find myself still somewhat perplexed. Forsyth, despite his flaws, was a man who would never have willingly conspired in a crime like this. His trust in Edmund was absolute, even if it was misplaced. You must have seen that from the beginning." Holmes's eyes flickered toward his friend, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Indeed, Watson, Forsyth's innocence was the key to understanding the case. He was never an active participant, merely a tool. His only fault was his unshakable trust in Edmund. It is the tragic flaw that so often leads to betrayal. But you are right to feel that there was something more to the situation, a deeper complexity at work." Watson nodded, still wrestling with the nuances of the case. Yet, even after all the clues, all the evidence that pointed to Edmund, I could not help but wonder, how did you know, Holmes? How did you deduce that Forsyth's business partner was behind everything? Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together thoughtfully. "The answer, Watson, lies in the smallest of details, details that others might have easily overlooked. Edmund had always been a shadow in Forsyth's life, quietly manipulating the course of their shared business dealings. But when the artifact disappeared, and Forsyth's behaviour seemed too nonchalant for someone whose business was at risk. I began to see through the veil. Edmund had become too comfortable. His subtle moves, his lack of concern for the missing object, these things spoke volumes. "Comfort," Watson repeated slowly. "You are implying that Edmund had no fear of being caught, because he was never truly at risk. He believed his involvement was concealed behind Forsyth." "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Edmund was not as careful as he believed. In fact, it was his overconfidence that led to his downfall. He never anticipated that Forsyth would ever suspect him, nor did he expect anyone to investigate his actions so thoroughly. But I knew better. When he failed to cover his tracks thoroughly and let his arrogance cloud his judgment, it was only a matter of time before his game would unravel." Watson paused, absorbing Holmes's analysis, and the most damning piece of evidence was his relationship with Forsyth, the trust that blinded both men to the truth. "Yes, Watson," Holmes said, his gaze sharpening. "It is a fascinating aspect of human nature, this blind loyalty. Edmund understood Forsyth's weakness and used it to his advantage. The more I delved into the business partnership, the more I realized how Edmund had positioned himself as the unquestioned ally, the one person Forsyth trusted completely. And that, Watson, made all the difference. It gave Edmund the perfect cover, and it made Forsyth the perfect pawn. But Forsyth was not completely innocent," Watson observed, ever the loyal companion to Holmes's deductions. "He did not actively partake in the crime, but he allowed himself to be manipulated by Edmund. Perhaps he should have been more cautious." Holmes sighed, a faint trace of melancholy in his voice. "Indeed, Watson, it is a common failing, not just of Forsyth, but of many. Trusting too readily, not seeing the signs of manipulation. But one must understand the psychology behind it. Forsyth believed Edmund to be his friend, his confidant. People do not readily question those they believe have their best interests at heart. This is the tragic irony of the human condition." Watson sat back in his chair, his thoughts turning inward. So, in the end, Edmund's greed led him to betray his partner. His overconfidence in his ability to manipulate the situation ultimately exposed him. "Greed is the root of many such crimes, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "It blinds the perpetrator to the risks and eventual consequences. Edmund thought himself invulnerable because he had the perfect cover in Forsyth. But his greed clouded his judgment, and in doing so, he left behind a trail of evidence that led straight to him." Watson regarded Holmes with admiration, always astounded by his ability to distill such complex cases into their simplest elements. "You always seem to see what others miss, Holmes. You find the connections that no one else can, and you always know where to look." Holmes's lips twitched in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I do not claim to be infallible, Watson. I simply observe. The world is full of clues. Sometimes one must look for them where others do not. It is a matter of seeing what is right in front of you." As the conversation drifted into silence, Holmes rose from his chair, his movements purposeful. "But I believe, Watson, that this case is now closed. The authorities have Edmund, and Forsyth has been cleared of any wrongdoing. Yet there is something about this case that leaves me uneasy." Watson looked up, perplexed, uneasy. "But surely the resolution of the case brings you satisfaction." Holmes paused at the window, his gaze scanning the street below, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Yes, Watson, satisfaction, but also a lingering sense of something unresolved. Edmund's actions were driven by a desire for wealth, yes, but there is something more. The way he manipulated Forsyth with such precision, the cold calculation with which he executed his plan, it speaks of a mind far more dangerous than I first gave him credit for. There is a darkness there, Watson, one that is not easily explained by mere greed alone." Watson thought for a moment before replying. "Perhaps it is the nature of the criminal mind itself, Holmes. They are often driven by something more than just material gain, a need for power, control, or something far deeper." Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers once again tapping on the edge of his chair. "Indeed, Watson, it is a complexity that I cannot yet fully comprehend, but perhaps in time we shall uncover more about Edmund and the motivations behind his actions. The world is never as simple as it seems." Watson rose, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "And we shall follow it wherever it leads, Holmes." Holmes turned to face him, his expression softening. "Indeed, Watson, the game is never truly over. There is always another case, another mystery to unravel." As the two men left Baker Street, the fog of London once again enveloping them, they knew that the world was full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The adventure was never ending, and Holmes, as always, was ready to pursue the next challenge, however dark or complex it may be. The final reveal. As the clock chimed midnight, Holmes and Watson sat side by side in their familiar Baker Street room. The case of Edmund finally concluded, yet there remained a lingering sense of unease in the air. The authorities had apprehended Edmund, but Holmes's mind was still working, the gears turning quietly as he sifted through the final pieces of the puzzle in his thoughts. Watson, ever the observer, sat in silence, knowing that Holmes was never truly at rest until he had fully unravelled the entirety of a case. It was late when Holmes finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. "Watson," he began, "I believe you are right in your earlier assessment. Edmund's actions were indeed driven by greed, but I also suspect there was another layer to this case, something far darker. A shadow of manipulation that ran deeper than even I initially realized." Watson sat up straighter, leaning forward. "Holmes, what do you mean? Edmund was the clear culprit. His involvement in the theft of the artifact, his subsequent betrayal of Forsyth, it was all so clear." Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was not one of satisfaction. It was one that hinted at the complexity of the case, a complexity that Watson had only begun to grasp. Yes, Edmund's greed and the methodical manner in which he manipulated Forsyth were the obvious facts, but there was something off about the way the entire plan was orchestrated. Edmund's overconfidence in his own ability to control every aspect of the situation made him sloppy in places. Yet his initial actions, his manipulation of Forsyth, were too precise, almost too perfect. Watson felt a shiver run down his spine, for he knew that whenever Holmes used the word perfect, it often meant there was more lurking beneath the surface. So, what are you saying, Holmes? Are you suggesting that someone else was involved? Someone who played a far more subtle role than we thought? Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of revelation. Precisely, Watson. The key to this case lay in the subtlety of the deception. Edmund was not working alone. Watson furrowed his brow, feeling the weight of Holmes's words. But we have all the evidence we need. Edmund's confession, his footprints in the hallway, his fingerprints on the stolen artifact. What more could there be? Holmes remained silent for a moment, his fingers tapping gently on the arm of his chair as he mulled over the final pieces of the puzzle. Then, with the characteristic abruptness of his intellect, he spoke. The final clue was in Edmund's plan itself, Watson. The way he calculated Forsyth's every move. The way he anticipated his partner's actions down to the finest detail. And it was all meant to divert attention from the true mastermind behind the entire scheme. Watson's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. You mean Forsyth? He was involved in the plot after all. Holmes shook his head, a small chuckle escaping his lips. No, Watson. Forsyth was nothing more than a pawn, but I do believe that the true mastermind was someone even closer to the heart of the operation. Someone whom Edmund trusted implicitly. The person who could manipulate him with the greatest ease. The realization hit Watson with a sudden clarity. You're talking about Sir Charles Forsyth's daughter, Lady Evelyn Forsyth, aren't you? Holmes gave a single sharp nod. Indeed, Lady Evelyn was far more than she appeared. While Edmund was busy manipulating her father, she was the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes, orchestrating the entire scheme. She knew Edmund's every weakness, every desire, and most crucially, she understood how to manipulate him. Watson leaned back, shocked by the magnitude of the revelation. But why, Holmes? What could Lady Evelyn possibly gain from betraying her own father? And, working with Edmund, she had everything. That, Watson, Holmes said, his voice low and contemplative, is the essence of the case. Lady Evelyn was a woman of extraordinary ambition, a woman with a mind as sharp as any man's, yet bound by the expectations of society. She was trapped in a gilded cage of wealth and privilege, but she yearned for more: power, freedom, control. Edmund was her vehicle, but not in the way he believed. She used him, convinced him that he was the true mastermind, all while she remained in the shadows, pulling the strings. She knew her father's weakness, his trust in her, and used it to her advantage. Watson shook his head in disbelief. But how did she manage to stay hidden for so long? How did she manipulate Edmund into taking the fall? Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile of admiration. Lady Evelyn is a master of manipulation, Watson. She understood that the key to controlling Edmund lay in his pride. She fed his ego, made him believe that he was the genius behind the entire scheme, while in reality she controlled the entire operation from the very beginning. She made sure Edmund's fingerprints were all over the stolen artifact, but left behind no direct trace of herself. And when Edmund's plan began to unravel, she simply stepped back, watching from the shadows as her loyal accomplice took the fall. Watson felt a profound sense of awe at the brilliance of Lady Evelyn's machinations, but also a deep sense of sadness. And now she will go unpunished. Edmund has confessed, and she remains free, her treachery hidden in the folds of deceit. Holmes nodded, his expression hardening. It is the nature of such minds, Watson. The ones who operate in the shadows, who manipulate events with such subtlety that they remain untouched by the law. But she will not escape justice forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it is buried. Watson sat back in his chair, reflecting on the complexity of the case and the darkness that had lingered behind the seemingly straightforward theft. I suppose, in the end, it is the masterful manipulator who wins, not the overt criminal. Holmes's gaze softened, though his mind remained ever sharp. Indeed, Watson. But in time the truth always comes to light, no matter how cleverly it is hidden. And though Lady Evelyn may have evaded immediate justice, there will always be those who seek to uncover the truth. It is the price she will pay for her own ambition. As the fog rolled over London, Holmes and Watson sat in silence, the weight of the case settling upon them. The criminal mind had once again been exposed, but as always, the mystery had left behind more questions than answers. And with that, Holmes was already turning his mind to the next enigma, the next shadow to chase, the next riddle to unravel. For Sherlock Holmes, the game was never truly over. It was, as ever, only just beginning.